Hey guys, and welcome to Cutting Through New Age Spiritual Bullshit. My name is Solar Bodhidharma, and today we're going to be looking at one of the big ones, Tantra. Tantra is maybe one of the most misunderstood concepts in the New Age spiritual arena. It came to mean ways of connecting with your partner, weird breathing exercises, conscious sexuality, and all the way even into escort and prostitution. One of the big problems is that interviewers, or one of the most common questions that Tantra teachers are being asked today, is what Tantra means for you, instead of what is Tantra. That leads us again into this subjective interpretation, and people start to use the word Tantra to mean whatever it is that they want it to mean. There is no right way or wrong way to do it. And actually nothing could be farther from the truth. Tantra is not some abstract or subjective idea that you can make it mean whatever you want it to mean. Rather, it's a bunch of practices that are related to a spiritual traditions, and they're actually quite specific. If you're following those things, what you're doing is Tantra, and if you're not following those things, it's just not fair or it's simply incorrect to call it Tantra. Just like you will not ask somebody what does Christianity means for you or what science means for you, what Tantra means for you is the wrong question. And you cannot make it to mean whatever you want to make it to mean because it's already a thing by itself. I cannot say that I'm eating pig and fucking on Saturday and that's my way of doing Judaism. Please don't judge me. You have your own way of doing Judaism and I have my own way of doing Judaism. I mean, that's complete bullshit. But because those traditions or those practices are familiar to us in the West, it's common sense for us. And because of Tantra is a tradition that was mostly unknown to us, it's very secretive. Most of the texts that Tantra is based on are not translated to English yet, so it's very easy to us to have this romantic, mystical idea. But then what happened is that more and more people are just using the word Tantra to justify whatever hedonistic and egocentric pursuits they have. And it's kind of like a license to do whatever the fuck you want and just call it, I'm doing Tantra. In some way, it's just another expression of this extreme relativism and pluralistic culture that we live in. But the problem with this is that when we use a term to mean whatever it is that we like it to mean, it basically means nothing and it becomes redundant. There is no point of even saying the word Tantra if it doesn't mean anything specific. So before we go into the details, let's lay some foundations and say that Tantra is a spiritual philosophy. It's an approach that in its core holds the revelation of the spiritual heart. It aims at self-awakening, liberation, and enlightenment. Now it's important to say that there is not one thing, like one school or one lineage, that we can say this is Tantra. Rather, the Tantra is related to whatever is derived from the Tantric scriptures. In that way, different spiritual schools and even different religions adopted Tantric techniques and ideologies, and those became the esoteric parts of those religions and spiritual traditions. And this is why we can see dualistic Tantra, Advaita Tantra, Shaiva Tantra, Buddhist Tantra, and much more. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. One of the most common ideas that I hear around New Age Tantra is that Tantra is 10,000 years old. Now, as much as it's fair to say that some elements within Tantra could be traced to the pre-Vedic Dravidian culture, and that culture is a lot of the time dated to 5000 BC and even older, it's not the same as to say that the Dravidian culture was Tantric. A lot of the methodology and the spiritual vision that actually make Tantra what it is was not developed until the 5th century AD. So if you want to date how old Tantra is, you cannot actually say that it's more than 1500 years old. And even if to be more specific and more correct, a lot of the ideas that we attribute to what Tantra is were actually developed only between the 8th and the 10th century. So when answering how old or how ancient this Tantric vision is, I think that it's more accurate to say that we're talking about 1000 years. That's it. Another very common idea is that Tantra is some form of conscious or sacred sexuality. That it's a way to maximize pleasure and have full-body mind-blowing orgasms. Now, As much as some element or some specific practices within Tantra could lead to the possibility of having prolonged orgasms or separating orgasm and ejaculation, it's completely wrong to think or to say that Tantra helps you to maximize pleasure. Maximizing pleasure or putting pleasure before everything else or on the top of the hierarchy, that's called hedonism, which is completely opposite philosophy from anything that the Eastern spirituality ever wanted to teach. In spiritual philosophy, and that's not just Tantra, everybody acknowledge that every mountain have a valley, every yin have a yang. And therefore, if you are maximizing pleasure, you're also installing a lot of pain and suffering for you in the future. Now, within Tantra, and what makes Tantra so special, it is that it does not see desire and pleasure as the root of all ignorance and therefore suffering. It does embraces desire, it does embraces pleasure as expressions of the divine consciousness. But that's not to say that it's pursuing those things or it's going after those things. There is a very specific techniques and methodologies to work with consecration and the science of karma yoga, so you can incorporate desire and pleasure into your spiritual practice, putting those in this context. But this is a bit more complicated and we're going to leave it for another video. So just to clarify this point, if you're doing a practice that as a man helps you to separate orgasm and ejaculation, and both as a man or a woman helps you to have mind-blowing multiple orgasms, and that's where the practice takes you, to more pleasure, to a feeling of maybe connection between you and your partner, what you're doing is not Tantra. It has nothing to do with this spiritual pursuit. However, if you find a way through sexuality, just like that you can find a way through any other thing, but specifically through getting into an altered state, prolonging the time of orgasm, and using that doorway into meditation, into self-inquiry, into deep, deep states of consciousness that helps you to reveal your true nature and who you really are, taking you deeper and deeper, then you can say that something that you're doing is of a tantric nature. So how did we get into this whole mishmash from the beginning? Well, in the early 20th century, the word Tantra arrived in the West. And unfortunately, beside the word itself, none of the practices or philosophy came with it. It was very easily associated with things like Kama Sutra. Through the Theosophic Society, it was another one of those esoteric Eastern tradition that was associated again with sexuality and openness, something that was very alluring to the Western mind. And as we see up until today, and especially through the end of the 20th century with the New Age movement, the sexuality part is a good sales pitch, and everybody's very interested in that. Today, in the beginning of the 21st century, the market is flooded with New Age sexual Tantra workshops, and almost none of them has anything to do with spirituality. In the best case, a very small minority of them is now focused on personal development, which is a good thing by itself, but again, it's not fair to call that Tantra or spiritual practice. Now, I have to admit, it is a little bit confusing. When we look at Tantric history, we see that different spiritual schools and even religions adopted things from Tantra, took the overall ideology, the spiritual vision, and the practices, and thus created the esoteric part of that religion. So, looking at that, it makes sense today that we will adopt Tantric ideologies and techniques and bring them into the modern age. And then we can create shamanic Tantra and maybe even Judo-Christian Tantra. Not really sure how, but it should make sense. The problem is that we really pushed it too far. Today we have Shadow Tantra, BDSM Tantra, and whatever not Tantra. And when we look at those workshops and practices, we actually see nothing that actually is coming from Tantra or have any kind of spiritual value. So how to actually know in the end of the day if what you're doing is actually Tantra just because somebody says it is, or it's something that has to do with emotional and personal growth, which is also a valid thing, but just not necessarily a spiritual practice, or that it's a complete nonsense and it has nothing to do with any of those. In my opinion, there is three ways that we can look at it. The first one is to check if the practice that you're doing or the philosophy or the approach that you're taking is rooted or coming from the tantric text. Those are the tantras and agamas. If you can trace the practice or the approach to what you're doing to the text, it's very much fair to say that what you're doing is tantric. The second thing is one of the more scholarly approaches, where they use the word tantra to mean any kind of group, school, or religion that adopts a majority of practices that are considered tantrics. If you are doing a bunch of those things, or a majority of those things, you can say that your practice is tantric, or that the group is practicing tantra. Some of those ideas and techniques are, for example, working with mantras, chakras, nyasa, working with yantras, creating rituals, and the belief in the transformative power of ritual. Deity worship and visualization of the deity, connecting, embodying deities. There is a strong emphasis on initiation, and specifically initiation by a qualified guru, as well as the idea of secrecy is repeated quite a lot throughout the tradition, as most of those practices are very esoteric. These last two parts are actually very difficult to come across, the initiation part by a qualified guru and the element of secrecy when we are living in this digital age. So there's those things and actually a few more. So if you're doing those things, if your practice is embodying those practices, again, it will be fair to say that what you're doing could be considered as a tantric practice. The third way to evaluate if what you're doing is an authentic tantric practice is to check if it goes in line, if it's embodying this supreme non-dual spiritual vision. Now, I have to admit, this is the most loose term from the three, but I think it's still fair to use it, and I'll explain why. When we're looking at the vast array of Eastern spiritual philosophies, practices, and traditions, it's very hard to find something that can compare or even come close to this non-dual supreme vision. You find it in Shaiva Tantra and also in Buddhist Tantra, in Vajrayana and Mahamudra. But beside those tantric approaches to life and spirituality, we don't have anything else that really compares. What we find is rather very dualistic approaches to reality. Good and bad, spirit and matter are two separate things, and the only way for freedom is to abide in spirit. We have what we usually call Advaita, and which literally translate into non-duality, and that's very confusing because when you actually look at most of the Advaita traditions, they're actually very dualistic. They believe that only consciousness is real, and then everything else is somehow an illusion. And there's a lot of very weird and confused ways to interpret what illusion and what real means. But it's only this supreme non-dual vision that actually allows you to incorporate, to bring together the existence of duality and non-duality all together as an expression of this oneness, of this omnipresence, of this expression of the divine consciousness radiating through matter, through consciousness, through everything that exists. So there's nothing else in reality beside that divine consciousness energy. So then, in my opinion, if you are able to bring this vision, this understanding, this way of embodiment into whatever it is that you're doing, could be a technique of washing dishes with awareness or taking out your dog for a walk. If it's done with that intention, with the intention of realizing your true nature, of going deeper in states of consciousness into the point that you are finding a space beyond time, beyond your personality, beyond your ego, a sense of connectivity with everything else in existence, then I think that it's fair to say that what you're doing is in its essence tantric. To conclude, in order to evaluate if something is this wishy-washy, hedonistic, new age pseudo-tantra, or if it's classical or even modern 21st century integral tantra, we want to see if it has some of those elements that we just mentioned. First, that it's coming from scriptures. That is very straightforward. Second, to see if it has the majority of tantric practices or tantric ideology. And third, if it's embodying this supreme non-dual vision, if it's seeing this inner connectivity between energy and consciousness, seeing everything in creation as the vibrations of consciousness, both the transcendence and immanence as the constant expression and beauty of the divine. And if the practice itself is aiming at allowing you to wake up to your true nature and realize that connectivity, that divine beauty in play. Alright guys, so that was cutting through New Age spiritual bullshit, addressing Tantra. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. If you have any questions, if you disagree, if you have anything to say, please leave comments below. In the future, there's also going to be a video about the history of Tantra in a much more pragmatic way, and also addressing sexuality within Tantra, as it's a very hot topic and I got a lot of requests for that. With that, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope that this video helped you to get a bit more clarity about what Tantra is and what is not. If there's any other topics specifically that you would like me to address, feel free to let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.